like to do is to present to you a little PowerPoint, and it has a certain theme in regard to the driving force of techno, and it has a certain angle, which I will present in a moment. And before that, I'd like to invite us to reflect a little bit before seeing the PowerPoint. Because why? Because the PowerPoint is actually techno and we are humans. So I'm going to communicate orally as a human being with you before the PowerPoint. And I will note a few points for us to think about along the way. Number one, as you've heard, we're actually dealing with multiple technologies, and 30 were listed there. What I will do is to focus on what the UN is covering at the moment in these next 2 years, as you will see. But there will also be reflections on what the world is interested in other words, the other almost 30 items that were listed earlier, as well as everything else, because everything is mutating every day. So it's actually much more than 30 ultimately, even though we will focus a little bit, at least in the PowerPoint, on what the UN has up its sleeve over the next 2 years. Number two is that we are dealing with multiple stakeholders. And while teachers, lawyers, political scientists, human rights defenders are important in this discourse, actually, we should partner much more with others who are interlinked with technologies, or business sector, obviously, but scientists, engineers, and ethicists also, and beyond, because very often we are in a gray area, precisely because techno is evolving every day. Thirdly, we are dealing with multiple rights. There's a tendency in a lot of the discussions to deal with freedom of expression and freedom of assembly online, offline, or right to privacy at the moment. But in fact, if you look at the spectrum of technologies, we are dealing with the totality of human rights, civil, political, economic, social, cultural. And importantly also, COVID has taught us a lot about that range of rights, including online gap, inequality, poverty, standard of living, access to health. So really, this broad perspective, holistic perspective, should be borne in mind as we look through the gamut of technologies that we'll be examining in a moment, as well as the implications for human rights and beyond. And then fourthly, as a preface, of course, we are looking to multiple responses. I'm a lawyer, but I certainly don't look to law as a response alone. In fact, in many of these countries, the law is a problem. In Southeast Asia, you know, the fake news law is prevalent in many countries, and that's very much linked with information, misinformation, disinformation, and very much also constrained by what the state sees as all those so-called defective practices, such as misinformation, disinformation. And we have to look to checks and balances because we are dealing with power in relation to human rights and technology, and the control factor, the power factor, the manipulation factor. And that invites us to look at a variety of responses through maybe some personal decision-making. I can opt in, opt out in terms of consent in regard to certain technologies, my data, for example. But sometimes you need much more in terms of an industry response, a stakeholder response. And of course, with human rights, we are dealing with advocacy, at least to the state. And today, to understand that there are many other stakeholders as linked with the state, and famously, of course, and increasingly the business sector in regard to its link with business human rights. There again, you have power relations coming in because techno is often in the hands of a few. Classically, the digital techno, as we use it now, is in the hands of the few, maybe in one country on that side of the Pacific, while others may be using techno as linked with the power on this side of the Pacific. And there are all kinds of implications in terms of the philosophy behind those controllers of technology. In fact, you can't escape from democracy either. You can't escape from peace issues. You can't escape from transparent governance issues. You can't escape from sustainable development issues, together with the environment, nature as it surrounds us. So those are four underlying linchpins that test us a little bit as we move towards the PowerPoint in a moment. But I want to also be a slight devil's advocate, or angel's advocate, where the devil or the angel appears. And I'd like to pose to us four dilemmas. Number one, the traditional approach to technology is to say that it's neutral, it's value neutral. And I said that 10 years ago. But today we are being questioned on that presumption. Why? Because there's so much integration between technology or different technologies and human or otherwise manipulation or influence. Famously, algorithms, which are behind the robots that have just been referred to. So there's so much integration of techno and values coming from other entities around the techno that we are also having to question that initial presumption as to whether technology is really neutral and value neutral, especially if it's been controlled by a few countries or a few platforms, a few companies on that side of the Pacific or on this side of the Pacific, or that side of the Atlantic or this side, but particularly competition for control between 2 or 3 major countries on both sides of the Pacific. Why don't we plan to live a life without electricity as well? Without technology, a little bit. I mean, we've just heard, you know, that we have these shutdowns, blockages in several countries. And it's easy to say the state shouldn't block, shouldn't shut down. But we should also be prepared, because even one major country in Europe was preparing the scenario of to face the scenario of no electricity this winter, and probably still is preparing, which will affect your computers, will affect your telephones. And in fact, that country was preparing some paper to relay messages. Or maybe we should think about, well, I don't want to be indulging in former animal cruelty, you know, pigeon messaging, etc. But I think we should be prepared a little bit and not to be too fixated on what we have. And we should enable our children to be a bit more prepared and precautionary, because a lot of this depends upon electricity. And there may be a world one day without electricity, as seen in Ukraine at the moment. So let's ask ourselves about that conundrum a bit as to what options we should prepare for. Thirdly, the old type of approach to techno was very much sort of human interaction, to create, to invent, to patent, and to produce. Sometimes with a sense of conscience, sometimes without a sense of conscience. But today, increasingly, we're not dealing with human beings, sentient entities, people who feel, who have a sense of consciousness. We are dealing with not animate actors, but increasingly with inanimate actors. Of course, you're a robot. But also there's a sort of mix coming in much more, as you will hear in a moment. I use the word hubots, humans who intermingle increasingly with robots and artificial intelligence and techno, which is increasingly changing our psychology, mental thoughts, our approach to life also. And you don't have to look very far. I don't have a car, and I use the metro and the BTS. You go in and almost no one looks at anybody else apart from the mobile in front. Now, that concentration of your facial sensibility with that robotic machine in front of you does affect your psychology ultimately. And we know that many children are fixated and are sadly also affected by a certain new type of disease or illness, so to speak, in terms of psychological, technological fixations. So we have to think a little bit about how we bridge well between the animate element of what we are and what do we stand for a little bit, which must bring on board some nice debates between us and ethicists and so on, and the inanimate element that's coming through together with this mix that you're seeing much more, which will pervade our lives increasingly. And of course, it is there already. You know, we'll talk about digitalisation, covering those 30 elements in a moment. And a lot of it's about content moderation or control, also by bots along the way, increasingly without human control. Now, that's a real challenge. Where do humans fit in as this inanimate phenomenon is pervading us, creeping into our lives much more? Inevitably in a way, but we don't have to yield to a sense of fatality. We still, as humans, hopefully have some values where we can negotiate, prevent, protect, remedy, etc. And then fourthly, all of you in a way, particularly from universities, are familiar with some human rights standards. In the ASEAN region, 3 human rights treaties, which are acceded to or ratified by all 10 ASEAN countries, the CEDAW, women's rights, CRC, child rights, and CRPD, persons with disabilities. And you probably know that we have 9 main human rights treaties. On that front, you know the spectrum of human rights standards to some extent, but they were often concretized years ago before all this mutation of technologies. And while they respond, of course, very importantly to many of the challenges of techno, precisely because it's a sort of vague area on many fronts mutating, you have to look to other entry points to enable us to humanize the process. And I think it's important for us to bridge between all these human rights entry points as well as the other entry points. And I will look to some of them. And some of them don't come from the human rights spectrum, and yet they interact very importantly today with human rights. So please bear in mind that one conundrum is, yes, we're talking about human rights, but it's actually a human rights plus entry point that we should look to. And it has to mean a certain cognizance of entry points to ensure our sense of equality, a sense of peace and tranquility, and a sense of safety, many elements of which are not too clear in some of the human rights instruments, but we have to look to other partnerships around human rights to ensure that, yes, we work towards non-discrimination, yes, we work towards non-violations and violence, and yes, we work towards our security and our safety now and for posterity. So those are my prefatory comments, and I will now invite us to have a look at the screen. Thank you. I didn't want to use the word driver or drivers. I wanted something more sexy, you know. So this title, especially for all of you, Emerging Technologies as Human Rights Challenges, as challenged, pivots of creation, pilots of destruction. And I want to invite us on board the pivots and the pilots to create rather than to destroy. I said earlier that we can cast the net very wide, or we can be a bit more focused. And currently, the focal point from a human rights perspective, of course, is the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva. and it has an advisory committee which can address some research issues as well as some advocacy issues. And last year and this year, 4 topics have emerged for special study, which will ultimately lead to some resolutions and some programming, ultimately as linked with all our countries. Number 1 is autonomous weaponry. Number 2 is neurotechnology. Number 3 is cyberbully. And number 4 is green tech, particularly on climate change. These are all part of UN resolutions and UN studies over the past 2 years, which will lead to concrete proposals in the next phase. But they're not all done yet, they're in progress. So we're actually preempting a little bit in a good sense to find our way as an input for these 4 elements to be touched upon by the Human Rights Council in Geneva, particularly in the next 2 years, because these 4 are based on resolutions in the past 2 years. And since we were listing some 30 tech concerns, I thought I'd pick out some of them, and some of them will cover impliedly the 30 plus which were listed or which we can think about. Biotech, which has new elements, nanotech. Thirdly, automation, which covers a whole gamut of concerns. And at the moment, very big discussion about gig platforming. Cybercrimes and security. AI, artificial intelligence, together with robotics. And AI as a term can be used to cover many things. But we're basically linking up with sort of machinery technology that can learn. It's machine learning and machine analysis tools, so to speak. But now maybe machine advising tools as well as machine deciding tools in an automated sense, with all kinds of dangers coming in if it's too self-automated, if it's not controlled at all. And this is one big problem. And human rights elements, human rights treaties and so on, standards don't respond that well yet to this emerging phenomenon. The other one is digitalisation, and that can cover many of the 30 plus techs that were listed earlier, including blockchain, including cloud computing, etc. And I wanted actually to touch upon extended reality in terms of, you know, your famous metaverse element creeping into our homes and schools and so on. But the word digitalization I will use as an all-encompassing term, which can cover many of the other 30 plus items that were listed earlier. So let's have a look at them, and we're going to concentrate on 10 entry points. Autonomous weaponry. There is great fear of autonomous weapons and self-automated weaponry, and you've heard already about drones, but it's much more than drones. We humans are now with the capacity to produce weapons that can kill automatically, and very precarious situation, because some of them can self-automate and decide for themselves as to whether they will kill. In UN circles, there has been a call for moratorium on this technology. And currently, the response, the entry point, at least internationally, is number 1, possibly to expand an existing weapons-related treaty, the 1980 Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, CCW, which is not a human rights treaty at all, but it's a weapons treaty as linked with the laws of war, and yet it's very important. So if we're dealing with human rights, we must be conscious of this a little bit, because there are discussions to expand this with another protocol that will possibly stipulate the structure in regard to autonomous weapons, and maybe prohibit certain types, maybe regulate certain types with various possibilities of verification. But there's also another track where those not so much enamored with CCW want to have their say slightly differently. So negotiations are now taking place under the UN General Assembly, with some 70 countries voting, or at least committing themselves to tackling the issue of autonomous weaponry through evolution of a certain structure. And that's coming up now, particularly as led by Costa Rica, I think. So inevitably, if you're going to look at human rights, you can't neglect the disarmament issue together with the traditional laws of war, which are now subsumed under what is known as international humanitarian law, which is to do with armed conflicts and also weapons. And I don't need to note all the human rights impacts that should be borne in mind, including threat to the right to life, indiscriminate attacks, and the fear that humans will lose control, and with all the negative consequences of dehumanization. 2, neurotechnology. Now, this is very interesting because it's a bit linked with my Hubots. Currently, the techno, which the UN has called for in terms of study, is the techno as linked with our neural system, cerebral, and the impact when interrelationship between each. Of course, everybody has mobiles, like it or not, but we are not sure as to whether mobiles, if we use them too much, will have some impact on your brain. But now we're actually moving beyond. I mean, it's not just Internet of Things in terms of things out there, but we're actually subsuming or consuming the techno within ourselves. And in future, it's not unlikely that chips will be inserted into some people's neural system or our bodies, particularly with very small scale types of techno running around in your blood vessels and so on. And of course, you can see that there can be some medical benefits, such as to counter Parkinson's disease, perhaps. But there are issues of safety and threat to the right to health. But of course, conversely, it also, in a good sense, might mean more access to the right to health. And the old concern of misuse of tech for human experimentation, as well as how we could share the benefits of scientific development together with techno a bit more. And the UN paper that has been prepared on neurotech, it's only a short paper that you can find on the internet, but it does raise new terms that might not be too familiar to us, including mental privacy, cognitive liberty, individual autonomy, mental integrity and identity, cognitive freedom, and psychological continuity. And one of the challenges also is the danger of neural augmentation, where this techno might mean that we're trying to augment the cognitive intelligence and power of the human being. So yes, especially if we insert too much into your system, we might become uber humans or humans who are half robotic. And maybe we are already, but be careful in terms of that. Thirdly, the forthcoming study of the UN Human Rights Council will link up with cyberbully, which is a consequence of techno, and it's also more than techno. But it does raise issues of freedom of expression, assembly, privacy, and is often linked with hate speech, disinformation, misinformation. And we have to look at how we deal with all these negativities in a moment. And it's certainly not a question of responding by law. There must be much more than that. And maybe actually, just initially, if you look at cyberbully, I mean, I've been bullied. I'm bullied on cyber. What do you do? What do you do when people call you names on internet? I deal a lot with LGBTI issues, or I also did this work for the UN for a while, and I get called all kinds of names, not nice names, on the internet. I'm bullied, but not quite enough to claim defamation. So I get called names, but not quite the defamation type where you can take legal action. So what do you do if you're cyberbullied? Of course, it's very easy to say that international standards, such as the Covenant on Civil Rights and so on, and we should have law and more to counter hatred, discrimination, violence. But actually, I tell you, my response to all those nice, not nice names, which were targeted to me in my work on gender diversity. Have a guess as to what I did. I sat down I sat down and prayed without being religious. I sat down and prayed so that those bullying me would be kind. That's what I did. And only in one instance where it was defamatory did I intervene to ask media to take that down from the media. So there's also a more direct approach of notice take down, which we'll look at in a moment in terms of some responses where we can interact with certain remedies. So you've got to modulate a bit and look at a graduated approach. And there's no substitute for digital literacy and education with empathy, where people can be kind, should be kind to each other, to be tolerant. And yes, I mean, we have to also be slightly strong in terms of sort of accepting the fact that we might be criticized, sometimes quite strongly, but hopefully not to the extent of defamation. But if you look at standards on freedom of expression, so of course, you should go back to Articles 19 and 20. And if you look at Southeast Asia, there are all these laws about fake news, etc., coming in. They don't comply with these international standards. And with fake news or hate speech, you can't just prohibit like that. Why? Because it's also an instrument of the state, which is used to control and to constrain freedom of expression. So there must be some standards internationally that help us to say, well, where should we have a law or policy on this? And the standards are Article 19 and 20, particularly, of the international system. And we'll look at this in a moment in terms of responses, but it's actually quite a high threshold, inviting us to look at responses in regard to incitement to hatred, which might lead to discrimination and violence, rather than just hatred or prohibiting hatred. How can you just prohibit hatred? You prohibit hatred not by law necessarily, but by human empathy, as has been voiced. But there must be some legal entry points in terms of human rights. This is where it's slightly more than that in terms of incitement to hatred. And if you think around the notion, which we can come back to, incitement to hatred is X calling upon Y to be nasty to Z. It's a three-person element where you need a law where it relates with hatred. But if it's X against Y, there might be some other entry points which we can look to, not just the law on this. So we'll look around this in a moment later. And also, of course, not just hate, but hate that might lead to discrimination and violence. So this stipulates a higher threshold, particularly in Article 20 of the Covenant on Civil Rights. And please don't tell me that your country is not a party. I know your country might not be a party, but it's still there to guide you. And it is invoked where every country here, where you go through the Universal Periodic Review, which does invoke standards based on treaties to which your country is not a party. And of course, with cyberbully, we have to look to the whole range of human rights being affected. And there might be techno solutions such as filters, but beware also of impingement on freedom of expression, and there are standards there together with the blending of rights and limitations. And maybe we need to work more beyond techno solutions. What about counter speech? Now, when people say nasty things about me, maybe I respond or don't. I generally don't respond, but some people might respond on my behalf to protect me. I can tell you the truth. I write to the newspapers in Thailand, and I don't look at the comments at all because they trouble me sometimes. But if you look at the comments, there are some negative comments, which I have to bear in mind and tolerate, but you also have positive comments protecting me, and that's fine. But psychologically, I don't want to get into it too much in terms of being fixated on all the memes and comments coming to me. But there is that counter speech element that should be borne in mind. And very importantly, we forget that when we use the internet, particularly, and Wi-Fi, etc., we are also dealing with contractual terms. I mean, you click agreement without reading all the terms, in fact, and you promise by clicking that you will not indulge in homophobia, whether or not your country has a law on it. But you promise already by contract, by clicking with the Wi-Fi, even though you might not have read contractual terms at the back. And ultimately, where there are violations, you also have the right to ask the platform to take it down. So notice takedown is a possibility. And I told you already, one defamatory comment against me, I contacted the media concern and it was taken down. And in fact, the police asked me, do you want to take action in terms of criminal defamation? I said, no, I don't like to go to court as a lawyer at all. Why? Because it's a lot of bother too. So I looked to other solutions. And not to forget that we also have industry self-regulation, code of conduct, and it's very much linked with a sexy topic in this region, business human rights, together with oversight. And the most famous oversight is from one major platform. One major platform is based in the US, and it has an oversight board who are academics and others. The oversight board will take complaints from you, actually. And that oversight board is also assisted by bots and others, content moderators along the way. And they have to deal with millions of items in terms of taking down elements on the internet. And a lot of the complaints to the oversight board are not to take down more, but to put back some of what's been taken down. So you can see this kerfuffle between freedom of expression on the one hand and the limitations which might lead to industry action, which sometimes might go beyond international standards too. But be careful also, because when you're dealing with industry self-regulation, a lot of it's linked to the contractual terms which you agree to. And that means, you know, a certain sort of private commitment between two parties, which can impose some conditions beyond your local law and beyond your international standards. Bear in mind that we also have principles concerning fair contractual terms. Green tech. And of course, we're now with COP27, and everybody cheers the fact that the UN has now adopted, has now concretized and blessed the right to clean, healthy, and sustainable development. And there's a new special rapporteur on climate change, and everybody's talking about defossilization and decarbonization and so on. And from a green tech angle, which will be a study of the UN very soon, it's interesting that some of the elements now being raised include the following. Of course, we want to flip from fossil fuels to clean energy, but clean energy also has its price. And even, you know, the call for wind turbines, well, we have a lot of problems today. We have cases, court cases between wind turbines on land and impingements on land holdings of local communities and indigenous peoples, court cases. And the other angle, of course, is that we have the Paris Accord on climate change, and we are not sure whether humans will be able to contain climate change within the 2-degree Celsius margin that we promised, potentially, hopefully, even 1.5, which will need both mitigation and adaptation of what we are, together with industry inputs in undertaking human rights impact assessment through due diligence. 5. Now I'm going beyond the 4 items of the UN, but the 6 remaining hopefully cover directly or indirectly the 30 elements listed earlier and more. But biotech is not always new, but there are interesting new elements for which the answers for which have to go beyond the human rights entities, actually. There are ethical and health issues that come into play. I think if you look back to our biotech, let's say 5 or 10 years ago, you would have been involved with the issue of GMP, genetically modified products, particularly the issue of safety. Maybe there was a discourse on genetic engineering then. It's not new anymore. But do human rights cover genes? Do human rights as a phenomenon cover genes? Because this is pre-birth. Huh? Human rights tend to cover birth plus rather than pre-birth. So the response actually has to be slightly broader. And you're probably familiar with the Convention on Biodiversity, and there was at a certain point in time a protocol in Cartagena on biodiversity, whereby there was a sort of precautionary approach of the country exporting modified mechanisms or whatever, products would have to inform the other country to enable the other country to take precautionary measures, or from a public consumption angle, it's sort of labeling also in terms of choices as to what tech we take or not, as well as related certification. Now, the issue now, particularly creeping on us, is through the World Health Organization, where genome editing is among us. And there's a big debate on whether you can meddle with DNA and cells. And the cells are split into two primarily. One is somatic cells, which are not so linked to egg and sperm, and the germ cells, which are or can be linked with egg and sperm. And of course, if we interact, I mean, part of it can be very positive in terms of preventing inherited diseases, for example. But again, we have to be very careful in terms of the Frankenstein that might emerge ultimately. And here there are elements of consumers coming in, possible certification, labeling, and oversight, and of course, increasingly human rights due diligence. It's interesting that the World Health Organization group of experts that came out with a report on this last year called for registries of places dealing with genome editing. But it has also been critiqued for not adopting a human rights approach, and there are others who are advocating that human rights due diligence should be brought in terms of looking at possible impact on human rights. But again, back to square one. Do human rights cover genome before they're humans or not? And in fact, we have an old declaration of UNESCO on this, which covered genetic issues and used the concept of human dignity to cover areas where human rights are not so clear, together with provisioning against genetic discrimination and protection of genetic data, which is becoming or are becoming major issues today. Nano is tiny tech, and of course it's linked with a whole gamut of human rights, and there are benefits, particularly in regard to health and scientific development, and it creeps into all kinds of things, maybe medicine, maybe Internet of Things, etc. But a very major issue is surveillance and security, particularly where the state or where various companies control the nanotech. And in fact, there's big competition for nano control, particularly by the 2 or 3 major powers, and one of which is involved in a war at the moment, and the other 2, which are involved in a slight battle of wills at the moment in terms of control of tech. So we have a big power issue, and even an area that might not be seen as human rights so much, patenting, does have human rights implications. Why? Because patenting might lead to global disparity and inequality. And we've seen this particularly with medicines in regard to AIDS and malaria and the like. And we've had to negotiate to have concessions for developing countries in terms of patents so that we can overcome the poverty and disparity, which are also linked with the various rights in terms of socioeconomic implications, and together with the other implications of privacy, transparency, and issue of oversight that I'll address later. 7, automation. I'm going to use this as a sort of slightly catch-all terminology. Why? Because I think it's important to bear this in mind, because we are in the post-COVID phase where the right to work has been questioned, and we have the gig platform, you know, your Uber, your Grab, your Line, people working through digital links, but they're not sitting at a desk, and there's no time limit as to what they should do. I mean, some of them work more than 8 hours a day, and there have been strikes in this country also in terms of these gig workers and whether they can be protected at all in terms of human rights. And as you can see, machines are replacing human rights at work, but humans are also adapting to different types of work, particularly gig at this point in time. So what is the right to work in a world of automation and post-COVID? And a lot of it's going to be linked with reskill and upskill. Work is no longer linear. You know, you're not going to be a professor for the rest of your life, I don't think, in future. Why? Because the robots can teach the students to some extent also. So professors might have to provide finite value added for obvious reasons. Likewise, you might not need lawyers or doctors on some fronts in terms of primary entry point to give advice, because you might have bots or AI providing you with the answers initially. And one big debate now is whether gig workers should be covered by labor protection law, or are they merely self-employed. It's interesting that the United Kingdom has come up with a sort of middle solution whereby they might not be employees 100%, but they are a new category of workers with some protection, such as guaranteed minimum wage, while not enjoying all the protections of employees, such as unemployment benefits. And of course, there's the interplay between employed and self-employed. And in some countries like here, the self-employed can also involve themselves in social security by making social contributions to get some protections, even though they might not have the total protection of an employed person under the social security system. Cybercrimes, cybersecurity. Oh, this is very much pervasive, and all the surveillance stuff with excessive national security claims. So many countries around here are going for cybercrime, cybersecurity laws, all of which are very dangerous. Now there's also a global process to draft an international convention on cybercrimes. Oh, decay of manipulation. I'm not going to tell you who's in charge, but you have a look at it on the internet. So you better beware as to who controls the power to evolve international treaties there. I think a better example is from the Council of Europe, which has a convention on the issue known as the Convention of Budapest. And if we are to have laws to cover cybercrimes and cybersecurity, they should be very specific, such as anti-fraud, anti-child porn, phishing, rather than general crimes defined by the state authorities. Very dangerous. On another front, I mean, I advocate a lot more digital security capacity development for NGOs and human rights defenders, because they also have to protect themselves from the creeping security elements of the state, particularly in non-democratic systems. And in Asia, you know, you're dealing with a very major group of countries which are non-democratic, which will enjoy having big laws on cybersecurity, cybercrimes, and so on, which will constrain very much the various rights and freedoms, together with the role of civil society as a check and balance. And I have to deal with all these, you know, internet gateway laws, cybersecurity laws, and Thailand's Cybersecurity Act is a big worry, because security people can confiscate computers and information without court warrant in the case where they define certain situations as a very serious critical cybersecurity risk. The law is now in force, and we'll have to wait and see the implications in the long term too. AI, robotics, and more, sort of analytics, etc. Human rights treaties and so on don't respond too well on this. I mean, we can claim, you know, right to privacy, expressions on that, but what do we sort of work on in terms of some guidance ethically, maybe soft law principles as to where AI and robotics should be going? UNESCO has come on board with this, and there are many soft and hard law positions, such as through the Council of Europe, European Union, US, and so on, and OECD, etc. And one element which is of great concern is remote facial recognition tech. And OHCHR has particularly called for a moratorium on this, and no doubt it will be part of the study in one way or another of the UN system. Now, a new recommendation or set of recommendations came out from UNESCO just over the past year on the ethics of artificial intelligence. And it does provide some guidance as to the ethical element as linked with human rights. So it does call for values such as respect, protection, promotion of human rights and fundamental freedoms, and concepts such as, don't forget, environmental ecosystem flourishing, to ensure diversity and inclusiveness, to live in peaceful, just and interconnected societies. And there are various principles that are invoked in dealing with AI. One is proportionality. You should be proportionate to your needs and be anchored in the principle of do no harm. And that means really testing the AI, doing human rights due diligence and taking precautions. Safety and security, fairness in distribution, sustainability, right to privacy and data protection, human oversight and determination, transparency and explainability. I like the new concept of explainability, you know, because very often we are dealing with techno that is not explained to people. And even the word, for example, algorithm is not understood by people, meaning the sort of formula that ultimately is used digitally, which might define certain outputs and outcomes in terms of social profiling. So what we're going to call for more in future is actually those who produce robots and those who formulate the algorithms and the outcomes should be able to explain to us in clear terms, easy terms, as to what they are. So we want access to all this, but we want a good explanation rather than a convoluted scientific blah, blah, here and there, which is not understood by people at large. Awareness and literacy, multi-stakeholder active governance and collaboration, together with ethical impact assessment, ethical governance and stewardship. Stewardship is also an interesting concept. I mean, we've used it particularly as a sort of means of looking after the environment, but now we're sort of using this more as a means to test the creation and ownership of tech with a view to the future so that our kids can also benefit well without the imbalances. Data policy needed, development and international cooperation, environment and ecosystem, gender issues, ultimately, culture, education, research, communication, information, economy, labor, health and social well-being, monitoring and evaluation. All those are part of the ethics of AI in general terms, which have to be translated into laws and practices, etc., locally. I like this explainability angle very much, so sort of right to access and to know that the decision is being made by a bot, and the right to seek a remedy, and the right to make a human behind it, accountable behind the robot. So you get jargon today evolving, such as humans. You must have humans in the loop in regard to AI, and that particularly with autonomous weapons, we say humans must be in command. And finally, 10, digitalization, which is, of course, linked with datafication, algorithms, and now this extended reality of avatars coming in on board, together with many other issues that have just been raised, blockchains, which are often linked with the computerized system of dealing also transparently with financial and other issues linked with crypto and the like, and many other entry points in terms of fintech, financial technology and the like. But you know, I mean, I want to be a devil's advocate here again. You think that you can protect your privacy in the digital world by having all those encryption and all your passwords and the like. You know, one day when quantum computing is really on board in terms of a more evolved techno system rather than the current digital chip type of techno, quantum computing will be to break all your codes and encryption. So please be careful. Nothing is anonymous ultimately. Be careful what you put on your digital system, even with encryption. It's not always going to be anonymous, nor is it really even now anonymous, because you know, you're being hacked and infiltrated all the time in terms of surveillance. So be careful. I don't type sensitive matter to be sent online. I just don't. I have other ways of dealing with it, maybe oral or just a personal visit even. But, you know, with oral, you also have to be careful because it might also be tracked. So don't put your eggs in one basket to think that, oh, it's going to be your right to privacy. You're going to protect what's on your line, your computer, by having encryption, and everybody's going to respect that. Technologically, one day it will be broken. And even now, there is seepage through state and other intervention. On this front, it's really huge. And do we have an international treaty that can guide us a bit on digitalization? We don't quite have a multilateral treaty under the UN, but we have a treaty from the Council of Europe known as Convention 108 that I wasn't going to talk about too much because it hasn't had as much influence as the one that I'm going to talk about now. But just to caveat that if you're really interested in this, have a look at Convention 108, which is an old convention from the 1990s concerning with the processing of personal data. And it was renewed or rather invigorated with an adjustment recently in 2018. And basically it says, you know, respect privacy and respect certain types of information, or rather don't meddle with certain types of information that should be kept private, such as genetic related information. That treaty 108 of the Council of Europe has had less influence than what I want to talk about, which is the European Union's General Data Protection Regulation, which is very much drawn from what was said earlier, the right to be forgotten. Now, very interesting. Number one is that people get totally confused about Europe because Europe has two systems. One is the human rights system under the Council of Europe with that 108 treaty, which has had less impact on digitalization and privacy. And the other is the European Union, which is the 27 member country, which is an economic entity. But the right to be forgotten, which was aired earlier, came from EU, didn't come from the human rights system. It came from the economic system through the other court, the European Court of Justice, in the case known as Costeja. Now, Costeja was a Spanish national whose information was on the net, sort of suggesting that he was on the verge of bankruptcy. And Costeja, years later, wanted all this taken off so that he would be forgotten. He didn't want to be remembered for those negative reasons. And so he sought a remedy, went through the Spanish system up to the European Court of Justice in Luxembourg under the EU, not the Human Rights Court in Strasbourg. And the European Union's court said, yes, you have a right to ask for the information to be taken down. Why? Because years later, he wasn't on the verge of bankruptcy at all. He cleared everything and he wanted to take all this unnecessary info on the internet down. So there was an order to take it down. And that then gave rise to a very famous European Union regulation for the 27 countries, which have extraterritorial implications, including for Thailand, because the new Thai personal data protection law is very much drawn from the EU's GDPR. And everybody today has to study this in terms of right to privacy in Thailand, which has cross-border implications because companies from Thailand or individuals controlling information operating in the European Union can be made very accountable with very major fines, billions of dollars at times meted out to various platform biggies. Now, this data protection regulation, GDPR, posits various rights, so to speak, building upon the right to privacy and the right to be forgotten, meaning that data, my data, if it's in the hands of a data controller or someone who processes it later, the data controller or the processor will need to get consent from me. And I can ask for access to take information down as well, to be forgotten, to erase information that is no longer relevant or necessary. So this consent factor is very much linked with protection of data as my private domain. And if I'm going to yield to companies to use it, etc., they need to seek consent. But if it gets there without my knowing, etc., I can have it taken down. So I can be forgotten, I can be erased, or I can be altered in terms of data on Wi-Fi and Facebook, etc. And the regulation also bears in mind the discrimination element that might arise. So it is conscious of the need for protections, particularly against social profiling and also vulnerable groups such as children. And today, I think we're zooming in on more protections for vulnerabilities, which we'll deal with in a moment. And one principle that's very important through the GDPR is data minimization, whereby whoever controls or holds the data should take the least, not the most, and to use it least for the very purposes that are legitimate, rather than just accumulating all kinds of data which are not necessary, but not necessary, but might also impinge on right to privacy of people. However, the right to privacy, for those interested, I think it's was it section or Article 17 in the Covenant, etc. The right to privacy is also open to limitations, such as public health, national security. But we say that if the right to privacy is to be limited, including in regard to the personal data protection law that's now arising in this region, Southeast Asia, due to the influence of the European Union, limitations on the right to privacy are subject to a three-part test. The government, particularly, that wants to use data by claiming national security, must prove that it is acting reasonably and in a non-arbitrary manner, not just discretionary, but based on rule of law, and that's the principle of legality. If the government wants to use our data, it must prove that it's necessary, principle of necessity, and only take what is really needed, and that is the principle of proportionality when our right to privacy is being impinged or infringed. And interestingly, it's not just the right, but how to build in complaints mechanism and remedies. So the GDPR, for example, has a trigger obligation of violators who must report, take action to remedy, particularly within 76 hours. And there are mechanisms for reporting breaches. And one of the problems today is your internet service provider, your intermediary. Some of the laws go beyond what's permissible internationally. And I was hearing one French law called the Avia law, which was adopted to cover internet service providers. That draft law in France obliged the internet service providers to take down illegal content within 1 hour. Can you imagine 1 hour? And that law itself was struck down by the Constitutional Court of France as being not reasonable. But the European Union system is 76 hours, and that's the one now being used in Thailand in terms of reporting. European Union has really gargantuan fines, at least 4% of the global income of particularly big platforms. And now we're in the throes of the new Digital Services Act, which does interlink very much with vulnerability factor, also linked with human rights. That this is very much going to concentrate on protection of children from being targeted by algorithms. And there's a move towards transparency of algorithm in terms of both accessibility, transparency, and explainability, bearing in mind that algorithms are often linked with the robots that are being used. US laws are also very interesting at this point in time, emerging in many, many states, such as the right to access algorithms and the right to know how it profiles us, as well as the right to remedy and to access humans for responsibility. And I've already said we have a new law here, Personal Data Protection Act, and other countries in Southeast Asia too, adopting this, very much influenced by the GDPR. And very importantly, the other side of the fence is that we also want access to public information in the hands of the government as a check and balance against the government. So that's another perspective of self-protection on our side. I want to pose some key challenges for us to think about. Number one is that one big country in Asia is also already using social scoring of people through digital data collection and facial characteristic and remote recognition technology. And this social score is now classifying people as being trustworthy or not. So be very careful that it's already here. Secondly, social profiling, which may lead to discrimination in regard to many characteristics. And that's to do with very much the algorithmic patenting and patterning, which is used to single out people for targeting in terms of how they are classified. I mean, I'm classified all the time, because I don't subscribe to some of the networks, but I do have a Wi-Fi, and I switch on the Wi-Fi to see YouTube, and oh my gosh, they know exactly what I want every time. My information might even have been leaked elsewhere. Targeted vulnerability as children. And of course, if it's war situation, civilians as victims of automated attacks. Issue of excessive data collection, algorithmic opacity. And the robots are the ones screening you, very often. You get rejected. Yes, quite often. Huh? I certainly do. When I'm applying and filling in forms and so on, it's being rejected. It's the one that's doing content moderation. And very often there is an overdue of content moderation without informing the subject, which is me or you. Likewise, we have two broad interpretation of exceptions to collection of data. For example, the invocation of national security. Famously, the governments love to say, oh, fake news, disinformation, misinformation. Well, as I said, I mean, there are ways of dealing with it in UN circles, particularly Articles 19 and 20 of the Covenant. And maybe with fake news, what we really want is wholesome, holistic education so that people be intelligent enough, well-versed enough to discern and distinguish between the information and misinformation, rather than just expect the state to come in with a law which might be manipulated. Frankly, I'm more concerned with fake national security, fake threats than fake news. Please think about that. Psychography. Oh, yes. The goggles that come in today with your avatars can also pick up the sensibilities of your facial expressions, as well as ultimately linked with your psychological state as your eyes twitch, your ears move, and your face mobilizes itself in response to what you see in terms of the avatars coming through your goggles. So a phenomenon that we have to be very careful is now psychography, where information about us is leading to certain presumptions or findings about our psychology through the data collected by extended and other reality. And even more challenging is that, your goggles can also pick up bystanders' data unknowingly. What about that? And last but not least, be careful with cumulative data as opposed to minutiae. I'd like to leave some dichotomies with you as to what we really have to deal with when we look at emerging technologies and how we should shift to the right-hand side in a balanced sense, rather than be the victims of the left-hand side. So, challenge of discrimination, whereas what we want is fairness and equality. Challenge of violence, whereas what we want is peace and tranquility. Challenge of authoritarianism, very prevalent in many of these countries, while we want participation and democracy. Challenge of exclusion, while we want inclusivity. Challenge of marginalization, when we want accessibility. Challenge of insecurity, when we want safety, and that's going to be linked with many of the principles that go beyond human rights as a whole. So it's a human rights plus challenge. Challenge of something very late, tardy, whereas we need to move towards precautionary approach, which is more anticipatory. Challenge of disparity, while we want equity against poverty. Challenge of monopoly. Technology is in the hands of the few, sorry, and we want to diversify under universality of principles. Challenge of opacity, while we want transparency and explainability. Challenge of violation, while we want accountability and responsibility. And challenge of techno-autonomy and determinacy, while we want humano self-determination and anthro-authority. Now that's to counter your robotic predominance, AI predominance, which might be determining our fate without our knowing the future in the inanimate sense. So please find your space for interaction. And I'm going to open up here to questions and round off with 10 entry points for the future. The entry points can be sort of hard law or hard policy agreements, or soft law, soft policies and good practices. And as I said, we do have some international agreements, but they're a bit sort of slow in responding to ethical issues and technological issues, particularly on emerging technologies. So you have to look at a sort of comparative perspective of regional and national settings as well. And as I said, on digital, you must look at GDPR That's the one that's creeping into Southeast Asia. And it's there in Thailand, absolutely. And we have guidance from Sustainable Development Goals that can be used, but slightly general. And we have the UN Secretary General's Common Agenda that was issued last year with 12 highlights. So let me take the one on digital. And actually, you know, if you look at this, it's actually very doable because it can be very personal without getting too complicated. So this is what's being advocated by the SecGen to improve digital cooperation. And all of us can be involved in this. That doesn't have to be complicated. Bear in mind, of course, what I was doing was to get into the heart, the essence, a little bit of what we see as emerging technologies today. Okay, so the advocacy from the UN is please connect all people to the internet, including all schools. This is not just expression issues at all. It's socioeconomic, cultural, in terms of right to education, overcome poverty and the like, particularly with post-COVID. Avoid internet fragmentation. What I would say, avoid internet monopolization, actually, because internet's in the hands of the few, and or it's the state that's seeking to control here and there by means of internet gateway laws and what. Protect data, apply human rights online. Well, we do. I mean, freedom of association, assembly is understood as well as offline and online, together with freedom of expression. But the practicality of it all is, as I said earlier, how do we deal with inequality? How do we deal with violations, violence? How do we deal with safety issues? And the claim of national security principled upon a very subjective notion of fake news, misinformation, and disinformation. I can summarize on this. There's definitely too many draconian laws in Southeast Asia that you don't need at all. Introduce accountability criteria, regulation of artificial intelligence, not quite there yet. And to see digital information and techno as commons of global public good. I like this very much. Let's have a look at viability of this in future. So let's look at the pivots and the pilots, all right? Pivots and pilots. Number one, a principled pivot is to advocate that rights apply online and offline. I think we all agree on that. Number two, rights universal and indivisible. Don't be only fixated on freedom of expression. We are claiming the totality, including anti-poverty. A very important principle, do no harm, which is linked with precautionary approach of taking action before programming. And even if you don't have complete data on dangers ahead, you can still take action on the basis of anticipation. Another pivot, we have some human rights standards complemented by local wisdom, coupled with good implementation, but it has to be enriched, or they have to be enriched by other elements of the international setting. Protection of rights, particularly in regard to vulnerabilities, through a variety of stakeholders is a pivot, obviously. Human rights due diligence coming in very much, particularly with the UN guiding principles on business human rights. The state has a duty to protect human rights. The industry has a duty to respect that framework. And both of them, state and business sector, have a duty to remedy violations, bearing in mind gentle mitigation and or more serious remedy in redress. So what are the pilots? Well, I've got 12 pilots for you, pioneering. One, we want to see more technological digital literacy and education with empathy. The way to counter fake news is not through law and more, but through an educated population. I'm going to advocate that. The way to counter hate is also through an empathy approach of education, cross-cultural fertilization among the young from a young age, rather than state intervention, which might be manipulated for authoritarian ends. We're going to want to overcome online gap and improve internet access for all. We can also work towards making some data part of the digital commons. And the new concept in the European Union is now to open the door to altruistic data access, whereby we can just convey our access into a common pool for people to use. And that's it, on the basis of our altruism. and no need to claim privacy anymore. Also, the importance of peer support and leverage, such as counter speech from groups. You remember my little example of responses to my newspaper articles, and I don't even read the responses, but yes, some people protect me along the way. And I don't claim that my articles that I like are good at all, but they are basically oriented to protection of people. Balance contractual obligations. We don't talk about this at all. I mean, which of you reads the contractual terms when you click, of which there are hundreds and hundreds of pages, including you can't indulge in homophobia, you can't indulge in transphobia, or you can't indulge in gender discrimination. Well, easy readability there might also be an interesting one in terms of contract, which might go beyond international law and human rights and the like. Why? Because we're committing contractually, consensually between two parties. Filter. Yep. Accessible filter and techno screening. But there again, you have to be very careful in terms of the standards of human rights, which must also be respected. Another one is self-regulation. Now, self-regulation is the industry itself, or maybe NGOs, setting up various rules for itself to comply with, maybe with an oversight board. And one very famous platform that most of you use, which I don't use, has self-regulation of these standards for itself, which it then integrates into the contractual obligations that you click when you say, I accept. And as I said, you know, simple rules such as no homophobia and so on. And that self-regulation of that big platform enables it to take down homophobic material or discriminatory material very easily. Millions of items are taken down by that platform, often by robotic intervention. And the oversight board of that platform is an advisory board that can take up issues in terms of the information taken down or not taken down. And most of the cases that get up to that oversight board are situations where information data has been taken down rather than to seek more taking down of information. So I think it's the bots taking down more information than necessary. And so that oversight board is there, but it's not a complete tool because it's advisory. Another one which is very interesting is what I call co-regulation, which means cooperation between business sector and maybe NGOs, civil society, and the government. Yes, we can cooperate sometimes. Sure. Why? Well, you know, co-regulation is possible, for example, on child pornography, action against child pornography. NGOs and governments don't really want to see child pornography. They can cooperate and they can have rules together and act together sometimes. One interesting element of example of co-regulation recently was the Belgian cloud services industry evolved some rules and regulations for itself, such as to respect privacy, and contacted the Belgian governmental authorities to agree with or to validate the regulation, co-regulation. And so it became a cooperation between industry and the government, and then later taken up to the European Union with a complaint system and oversight board impliedly. So that's also possible here and there, even though it might be difficult on other fronts, such as what the government claims as hate speech and what we feel should be dealt with through other ways and means. Human rights due diligence, definitely there, absolutely. Every time you have a techno issue, that's the one creeping in, which means human rights impact assessment, particularly by the industry. And there are guiding principles on business human rights, which particularly tackle issues of transparency or protection of human rights defenders who are claiming the need for diligence and remedies and so on. So that's very much a current phenomenon of concern. Another one is certification, and people don't talk about this enough. I will talk about it, because if you're going to have a drone for military purposes, it might need to be certified so that it's not a drone that could just self-kill without some accountability and human control behind it. So certification is also possible, and we used it very much in terms of the consumer lobby, in terms of GMO and other types of products And that is linked also with labeling, because from the consumer leverage angle, sometimes the consumer wants to sort of endanger itself a bit more, and it can choose to do so. And that means some labeling so that the consumer can choose. And lastly, stakeholder participation and cooperation. We're also in the throes of possible monitoring by NGOs and the like through gender index scorecards, which can provide incentives for progress and disincentives. Data index, very possible. But the one I deal with very often is gender index. So that is particularly an index evolved by civil society to measure the application of gender sensibility by big companies, such as, oh, are you open to gender diversity? Does the manager commit itself to human rights, including gender diversity? Are there facilities to recognize social protection for gender diverse people? If there are violations, are there complaints mechanisms possible in the factory, etc.? So, and then a score is given, 10 for this, 10 for this, or subtracted. And that provides a certain industry-linked measurement of what the industry is doing, with some incentives such as prizes, awards, and disincentives where points are taken away. And then if there are real violations, of course, advocacy through the media, etc. So that's where we are in terms of those various pilots. And ultimately, of course, we are looking to some standards of conformance in terms of conforming to basic human rights standards and implementation, which are linked with a variety of ways and means. We need good laws. We don't want all these bad laws, such as so many fake news laws, so many draconian laws in this region. Suspend them and reform them if possible. Now, one element before I round off is this. A lot of us have to deal with hate speech and fake news related issues, together with misinformation, disinformation, and it's the government responding by having more law. Actually, we have to negotiate a bit with the authorities in terms of, if they are to have a law, what sort of law it should be, rather than just enable them to have a bad law, which controls too much. The guidance on this front is to go back a little bit to the Covenant on Civil Political Rights, to which 6-7 countries in Southeast Asia are parties. And a very important guidance is Article 19 and Article 20 of the Covenant. And let me just flag this a bit, because I think it's important for us to know a little bit so that we can negotiate with authorities when they're claiming the need for more law. Basically, the principle is under Article 19 is expression, freedom of expression. Freedom of expression as a human right, of course. Freedom of expression is subject to two major limitations, which are permissible limitations under Article 19. And I think, as I say, this will click with you. Number one, you can't use freedom of expression, including information, to defame people. So defamation is forbidden, and that's fine. I mean, you can't defame me because I'll go for notice takedown, or I take a court case. The defamation is the ruining of someone's reputation. But the problem in our region is that while we can constrain freedom of expression in regard to defamation, the law that we use is criminal law, whereas it should be a civil action, not crime related so much. Defamation should be civil liability, not criminal liability. And this is a big problem in our region. Exception 2 to rights of freedom of expression is national security, public order, public health, which means COVID. And you can see that during COVID times, public health, particularly through COVID-related laws or national emergency laws, were used not only to cover health issues, but also to suppress freedom of expression on many fronts, beyond what is permissible internationally as public order, public health, national security. So every time they raise public health or COVID or emergency or national security, we have to advocate the three-part test that I was talking about earlier, which is the parameter for those limitations, such as national security, public order, public health. And the three-part test, as you may know, are legality, necessity, and proportionality. In other words, limits have no limits, and the government has to justify limits on the basis of whether it's legal, legitimate, necessary or not, and proportionate to the risks. That's Article 19 on freedom of expression. When you link it up with this fake news, disinformation, misinformation stuff that's very prevalent in our region, then you have another entry point which provides you with some guidance of whether you need a law and more, and that is Article 20 of the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Particularly Article 20 deals with the phenomenon of hate, but in a very conditional manner. Article 20 says this: the government must prohibit, take action against incitement to hatred that might lead to discrimination, hostility, and or violence. Now, if you look at that sort of wording, it's exactly the triangle I was talking about earlier. In other words, if you feel you need a law to deal with fake news, which might be linked with hate, it should be high threshold. In other words, it's a triangular relationship where X incites, provokes Y to try to do something nasty to Z on the basis of hate leading to discrimination, hostility, and or violence, rather than X hates Y. With X hates Y, you have many other entry points that I've referred to, your 12 pilots, including more generous education in terms of empathy, or some other entry points such as contractual obligations or self-regulation, etc. Many other means of acting, and not just going along with a new law all the time. And in regard to the fakery angle of information, misinformation, of course, the 12 pilots that I've been talking about here also offer you various options to deal with them without getting to this difficult and murky area of let's have more law to control, leading to more draconian measures and more state power and less freedoms, leading to a cloistering of democratic and civic space. So that's what I'm advising you if you really need to, what type of law do you need on hate, as linked also with fake, as linked with also disinformation and misinformation. Use the various pilots, please, and don't just have another new draconian law. You can also work towards policies which complement these laws, such as the Sustainable Development Goals, good practices, good casework, good mechanisms and personnel. You've got national human rights commissions, but they're often a bit behind in terms of techno. So you need mechanisms actually that interlink with techno industry. Countries are now establishing data specific monitors, particularly in Europe. Okay, the European system now is going to have very specific oversight monitors on data, and the European systems are also concretizing middle-level vetters of information. They're now introducing a system of so-called flaggers. Flaggers are basically watchdogs, whistleblowers, who will then report to the national authorities, which must be independent authorities in terms of data monitor. And again, remember, it's all about, those European countries which are democratic. In Asia, be careful, really, about all mechanisms and government-related personnel, because you are framed also in this region by half democracy and non-democracy. So you need to build a system of checks and balances. National Human Rights Commission maybe work here and there sometimes, or very importantly, our mechanism, civil society interaction and leveraging. Resources, including social will and budgeting, very important. Data and monitoring. You have to monitor the data system, and that is increasingly happening, particularly with personal data protection laws and the like. Education, capacity development, obviously as an entry point for human rights implementation. Remedies and accountability. Leadership, very important, and we're not talking only about civil society being leaders in monitoring. We want good leadership from governments, as well as business leadership, as well as ethical leaderships from doctors, engineers, scientists, and so on. And that's why we have to broaden the space of multi-stakeholders. Likewise, inter-stakeholder participation and cooperation, very important. And this can lead to perhaps formal or informal arrangements and agreements at the national, regional, and multilateral levels. And of course, everything is in a state of flux, as you know, but there's still rules, preferred activities, preferred pivots, as well as pilots that we can enjoy today and build even more in terms of checks and balances to deal with the power of technology. What's the all-embracing aspiration there? Well, you know, between pivots and pilots, let's create rather than destroy. And surely for all of us, you know, in our small ways of working to bigger ways of acting, we need to be not only tech savvy, but also tech, yes, happy, which means start small, do little things around you and maybe reach higher, but give hope and give a light in terms of human rights, democracy, peace, and sustainable development, all in partnership to fly, hopefully in safety and in dignity. Some rights are not absolute, huh? All right? We have to bear that in mind. And even the right to education, which may mean the right to choose various means of education, might be constrained by some considerations of national security, public order, and the rights and duties in regard to other people. So if you bear that in mind, it's not whether we have a right only to choose whether to use techno, but what's the relationship with the student? Because we also have to be respectful of their potential to learn from us. They have the right to education as well, while we might claim the right to academic freedom. So that's a sort of balancing. And to bridge that together with national security and public order, public health phenomena, you have this parameter that comes into play, such as, oh, is it something that is sort of legitimate legal, or is it discretionary on part of the authorities? Is it something that's necessary, or is it something that's proportionate to circumstances? So back to square one on that. The state can guide you to some extent in terms of your academic freedom and the relationship with right to education. But that guidance is dependent upon how the state also justifies what it dictates as what you should use, or options that it may provide or not. So it's not absolute, and it's a very relative thing. But don't forget also the right to learn, the right to education by the students, because rights on this side also correlate with rights of the students. With that, I just give you a little example also of how we compromise a bit. Very live situation. The online here is very much prevalent, or was very much prevalent during the pandemic. And there was no option apart from that, to some extent, now, having said that, to some extent, because even if the online was an option during COVID, a lot of people had no access to online. And others, in a very resourceful manner in some other countries, also had options in terms of maybe teachers going around the community directly rather than just banking online, which was not available on many fronts. So I'm giving you that perspective as a way of looking around it also. Online, yes, but also other ways of interacting with humans and students. And the government should really be cognizant of that. Why? Because there's a big online gap which has to be overcome. And unless we overcome that, you know, there must be other ways of dealing. And on the online itself, a very interesting dilemma on this side is this. Must the students switch on the facial block online or not? Because of course the teachers switching on like now. And it was a very personal dilemma because some people get used to not switching on the facial presentation, appearance, apparition, so to speak. So I personally consulted many people, and my outlet on this was this. I would ask students to please switch on so that we can interact, unless they have a reason not to. And so we go through this process, and some students don't want to switch on because they're borrowing the machine from somewhere else, or then very difficult circumstances in terms of locations. So that's fine. So that negotiation is also very important in terms of what is the preferred option online where it's there. So that's my response to you, and not as an absolute, but it's actually very relative in terms of the various rights together as well as the various limitations, with some guidance in terms of the parameters of each. Well, you're dealing with power relations there, and as I said, you know, I mean, we have on the one hand the power spectrum of the information and techno being in the hands of the few, and so from a rights angle, of course, we press for access and the sharing of the benefits of scientific information, and that's part of also the right, part of the right to development, as well as the access to scientific information and its benefits. So if you want a rights angle, you can claim that as well. But very importantly, as we know, big data is in the hands of the few at this point in time, and that's why you need some balancing or cross-balancing. And I don't want to flag the European Union too much, but it's happening very much in the European Union. Why? Because these big data, the big platforms, now have to take all these measures subject to huge fines, billions, as a counterweight to what the big data, particularly the private platforms, the big ones, are doing. That's in regard to Europe and the States in particular. So the latest that with the Digital Services Act, which adjusts the GDPR, the fines will be 6% of total income of big tech companies. So that's a way of dealing with this as well, in terms of power balancing through various entry points, such as law based on the right to privacy. Having said that, one big problem is in our region, big data is in the hands also of some countries or some platforms which are not very democratic, which means that we have to work even more in terms of balancing through advocacy, balancing through partnership building between civil society and hopefully the business sector here and there. This coalition building is very important, particularly to counter some of the excesses of very half-open and non-open societies over here. So it's more difficult than in Europe in a way, because in the European system, as I said, you have the European Union, democratic basis, as well as European Court of Human Rights, the CO's, Council of Europe system, which is also based on democratic premise, with more checks and balances. Well, we have less than checks and balances, but you still have to work on the basis of dealing with power relations and use those rights and rules well to advocate the need for countering monopolization or oligopolization. Thank you. Hope you enjoy it. Thank you.